Greetings, diners and other Doom fans, and welcome to another edition of Sunday Morning Brunch on the Collapse Cafe of the Doomstead Diner. And once again today, we're not focusing on coronavirus. We are further discussing a very important aspect of not just the coronavirus situation, but collapse in general, which is food. All right, food problems for the population at large are the fundamental cause, at the bottom line, of revolutions, of problems, political problems in the streets, and so forth. You know, you can look at what happened in Africa with Mohamed Baziz, I believe his name was, the fruit vendor in Algeria that set off the Arab Spring. When people run out of food, they get pretty pissed, okay? And things happen. And so it's always been a major concern of mine, the food aspect. And, it doesn't hurt that I was a chef and, I love food. I've always loved food, good cooking, good restaurants, etc. So it's a focus for the diner. And, that's one of the reasons that you have the name Doomstead Diner. Okay, food, diner, food. You see the connection? So anyway, we're talking again with another person concerned with these topics, Irv Mills, who runs his own blog, which is the easiest person to fool, and you'll see it in the background there, and who has a lot of experience. We talked with him about power generation. He's a veteran of the Ontario nuclear power and hydroelectric power generation facility or authority. Worked as an electrician for them for 31 years. And but he also knows a whole hell of a lot more than that. And we're going to talk about some of it today. So anyway, without further ado, let's go to Irv. Irv, good to see you again.
Yeah, likewise, Ari. Nice to be here.
Yeah, and your set looks the same. And let's move your little icon over here onto the other side, in case I use that shot. So anyhow, we talked about your community garden, the food production, and so forth in our previous episode. A little bit about distribution and so forth. I talked about my program for handing out free food to my community. But today, let's go more in detail about aspects of food preparation, food not production, we did that, food preservation, and just in general, what things are good to consider when you are considering that collapse is coming, just-in-time delivery may fail at some point, may fail permanently, may fail temporarily. What are the things you want to do and be ready to do when that situation hits you? So where do you want to start?
Well, I guess I made myself a little outline, which covers most of the stuff we had discussed earlier that you wanted to talk about, and a few other things. I guess if you're preparing for full-fledged collapse, or even what you and I are more concerned about in the short run is temporary breakdowns of supply chains and infrastructure, which would leave us without things. I guess the first thing would be water. And just very briefly, you should have some stored, enough to last a few days. And there's, many ways of doing that. I guess one thing you were mentioning, I certainly agree with. If you've got lots of cash, it's pretty easy to buy anything you want in the way of preparations. And certainly I've got some nice heavy-duty plastic carboys down in my cold room that hold 5 gallons each of water, and I'm pretty well set. But they weren't cheap, and in fact, most people in the course of their day-to-day life throw away lots of 2-liter, what I would here in Ontario call pop bottles, soda bottles, or you get 4-liter jugs that things come in. They can be used to store water as well. And then you get into filtration if you're really serious about this. And again, you got some cash, you can buy some nice filtration equipment. There's, however, for those who would rather do it themselves, here's a thing I built a few years ago. Oh yeah. Let's see if we can get it in camera. Well, you sort of can, and I'm giving a good advertisement to the local hardware store. But
looks like a nice big plastic bucket. What does it do?
Well, it's a pair of buckets. The top one you pour dirty water in, and let's see if the camera can catch this. There's a couple of filters in there.
Okay.
And I had to buy the few filters. And just installed them in the top one. The water drips through into the bottom bucket. And there's a nice little spigot at the bottom. And away you go. You can buy ones all made out of stainless steel and pretty as can be. But they cost several times what it cost me to build that. So you can just hook up do-it-yourself water filtration, and you'll find any number of sets of instructions on the internet for how to do that.
What did it end up costing you to put that together, roughly?
That was a few years ago, probably less than $50.
Less than $50.
And most of that was the cost of the filters. I think I actually just out of laziness bought the buckets, but you can, if you nose around, you can find lots of people who have empty buckets and are just about go to throw them away. Right. Because whatever they use has come in the bucket. So anyways, that was kind of a bit of a tangent from what we talked of earlier, but I wanted to get that in.
Well, I'm still curious about some other stuff with that. Now, on the filtration, okay, how much throughput? In other words, if you filled up the top bucket, how long does it take to filter that into the bottom bucket so it's clean?
And a
few hours. And then what about cleaning the filters, replacing the filters?
Well, if you were planning on having to use this as your water source for a long time, it would be really good to have some spare filters on hand. And I only put 2 filters in there, trying to keep the cost down, but you could easily mount 4 filters in there and it would filter twice as fast. Yeah. Did I get all your questions there? I get talking.
Sort of. How long would you estimate? I don't know if you've run through a filter yet. How long? You have not run through a filter yet.
I haven't, but I looked that up. And, for your typical, I think they quoted for your typical family of 4, this would maybe last a couple of years. And that depends. That depends on what you're filtering it. If you're scooping your water out of mud puddles, it's not going to last as long. But if you're going to a lake or a stream where you have good reason to be uncertain about the safeness of the water, this will take out, bacteria and protozoa and all that kind of stuff. rendering it much safer.
Most of the bad stuff comes out, but it's not going to remove like heavy metals or stuff like that, right? I mean, filters won't do that.
You can get filters that will.
Oh yeah.
But I was more concerned about the living things, and with a nod to coronavirus, it won't filter viruses out because they're just too tiny.
Yeah.
Compared to bacteria. Yeah.
Yeah. Viruses are their own little itty bitty animal.
Yeah, that's for sure.
But actually, they're not animals; they're viruses. But they're itty bitty and extremely hard to filter. And we've had that discussion on the diner as well about good filtration is. And then there's other things you can do. Obviously, you can render the viruses ineffective if you boil the water. Okay.
Absolutely.
The viruses won't survive if you boil it first. So you can do that in addition to the filtration, and then you're going to be pretty fucking safe. All right. So that's water.
Moving on from water to food, I would say if you're looking to learn a skill that would be of use in any sort of a catastrophe, collapse type situation, probably cooking is the one.
No, yeah. No.
Because assuming for a start that you have some food around, it's not going to do you much good if you can't cook it in some way or other.
No. All you know how to do is throw something in the microwave, or take a can of pre-prepared soup and open it up and boil it over the stove. That's all you know how to do. Then you're pretty well fucked when JIT comes to a close. And
it's true.
So cooking and the ability to take raw foods and make them into something that a person can eat, not that they can just eat, but they actually want to eat, that actually tastes good and looks good.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, and that's really fundamental. And the other thing, of course, is that you hear people talking all the time about whatever they're enthusiastic about cooking. And the thing is, cooking is a thing that tends to be unique to the culture you grew up in. And, so I don't proselytize much on the kind of cooking that I grew up with, which is pretty much what I do now, although I spread out a little from the fairly bland diet of a typical Southern Ontario farm family. But anyways, whatever
national dish in Canada. What are Canadians saying? I mean, the Brits at least have fish and chips. Okay, they're not exactly big cuisine either. But what is a national dish or something that Canadians prepare all the time? I'd be really interested to know that.
Well, where I grew up, and that's really all I can speak to, it would be probably roast beef, mashed potatoes, vegetables that most people would consider overcooked, that kind of thing.
That sounds like Brit cooking.
Yeah. Well, and that's our background, of course. So, and we have, there'd be pork and chicken as well as beef. And a lot of potatoes, though. Pasta was something that was a rarity in our house, and so was rice. I eat them a lot now, but traditionally speaking, not too common a thing hereabouts. Of course, when you can't generalize about Canada because it's a mosaic rather than a melting pot. There's people here from all over the world, and we encourage them to keep their own cultures. So you can go to a big city like Toronto, and I challenge you to name a cuisine that you couldn't find a restaurant of.
And then of course you have the dichotomy with Quebec, and that's French, they were
Yes.
colony, and so I imagine the cuisine over there is substantially different.
Well, the traditional farm family somewhere out in the countryside in Quebec, probably, I'm pretty sure they have a standard sort of cuisine too, but I'm not real familiar with it. There's a kind of a meat pie that's fairly famous there, a tortière with meat and a nice pie crust type thing around it. I've had it and I enjoy it. You know. Uh, anyway, that's the kind of thing.
Let's not go off on too big a tangent.
No. Okay. So the other thing, I guess, is what I would advise people, even our government and yours as well, always used to say you should have enough food to last you 3 days if deliveries stop. In the last while,
that's way under what you need.
Absolutely. But a lot of governments in just the last year or two has started to say, you maybe better should have a couple of weeks. And I agree, that is still pretty minimal. But what they were saying was, at one point there was, if there's a catastrophe, we don't think we want to guarantee that we can get to you to help you out in quicker than 3 days. And now they're saying, we think maybe you should be prepared to get by on your own for 2 weeks. Now, fellas like you and I would probably say, make it months or a year or two, depending what you can afford, because of course it costs money. But there are some things that are pretty easy to stock up on. They're not horribly expensive, and they store well. They don't require a lot of fancy technology to store. Now, I have a deep freeze downstairs, which has quite a bit of meat in it, and that's wonderful. It's nice to be able to buy meat in bulk at lower prices than you'd pay in the grocery store. And, okay, now I got to deep freeze, and it takes power. And what happens if the lights go out, if the power is off, if the grid fails, even temporarily? I studied up on that recently, and a deep freeze is probably good for a day or two if you don't open it too much.
Yeah, I've been through that, actually.
Yeah.
I had that experience with a power outage that I wasn't aware of, actually. And it wasn't a general power outage. It was just a circuit that ran.
Yeah. But that's all it takes to knock your deep freeze out.
I hadn't opened the freezer in a while, and I opened it up, and the shit's melted. I had to throw out half of what was in the freezer. But I caught it in time so that, like I said, I threw it about half. And you do have to watch out for that if you're using freezing. And freezing, to me, with meat, and meat is a big consideration of mine. That was what I did in the restaurant. I was a meat man, a butcher. And I, I've always been a carnivore, a heavy meat diet, paleo, I guess they call it these days, meat and fat, protein and fat. And so, this was important to me. And so, after that experience, I thought about that. And, I have hooked up electrics now, my backup electrics, so that if I do have a power outage, and I got to monitor the fucking freezer, of course. But if I do have a power outage of, anything less than about a week, I can run it just off my battery systems. If it goes longer than a week, then I have to run my Jenny, which is a generator. And it's a portable generator. It's only 2,000 watts. It's not huge. You can carry it. But it provides enough juice to charge my bats, which then can run my my freezer. So
Yeah.
a few hours charging the bats, and then I'm good for another week. Okay, so I can go quite a long time as long as I have the next step, which is the supply of gas for the Jenny. Okay, and
Yeah.
and then I
Yeah.
keep a supply of gas for the Jenny. All right,
Yep.
just in jugs, and then if absolutely necessary, I could drain the tanks on my two vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
I have
Mm-hmm.
an SUV that has a 15-gallon tank and a full size van that has a 20-gallon tank. So that's 35 gallons. That's
That'll
going to
last you for quite a while,
quite some time. Yes.
especially if all you're doing really is running it once every few days to charge up the batteries to run the freezer.
Yeah,
Uh,
it only
I
uses a gallon or so, in 9 hours. I mean, it
Yeah.
doesn't use a shitload of gas.
Yeah.
Uh,
And I have a generator too. I don't have batteries, but similar plans. Uh, but that's all pretty complex. And we can take a step back and say, is there something that we could make food out of that would be simpler? And yeah, I like meat too, but it's also good to have some backups. And traditionally, the staple foods of most cultures have been very based on grain, whether it's rice, wheat, corn, barley, rye. Uh, and one of the reasons for that is just that it's pretty easy to store grain for a long time.
right.
Wheat in particular, for instance.
I believe the first cultivated crop at the beginning of the ag revolution, when we went from Neolithic to Paleolithic, or is it the other way around? Is was millet, and I think that occurred around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, and it
Yes.
coincided, in fact, with the development of metallurgy, which allowed the production of the tools that we use these days to
Yeah. Yeah.
harvest stuff.
And
So you
and
can,
not long after that, people started growing wheat, culminating in, I don't know how well the camera is picking up this handful of wheat I've got
and
here.
raise your hand up. There you
Yeah.
go. Okay, good sort of see it.
So that's I've got sitting on my knee here a 5-gallon pail, plastic pail of wheat, hard red wheat, good for making bread. That
Did you grow that wheat yourself?
I didn't. I did not. But it came from a reasonably local farmer. And I have gone to farmers and got wheat a couple of occasions. I have a bucket of rye out there that a farmer who is a friend gave to me. That bucket that I've just set back down on the floor dates from 2008, and the wheat in it is perfectly fine still to use for
What did you
food.
say? How old? How long?
That would be about 12 years,
12 years.
11, 11 12. Um, and it'll last lots longer than that. It may not be, it may not germinate very well. In fact, I tried sprouting some of it a couple of months ago and didn't get a very good percentage. So that's one thing. Anyway, so
Get some, then you can
yeah,
build.
if you get a few, you can start things up and eventually get going on wheat again if there was no other alternative. Um, Now, you can just boil this stuff and eat it like a crude sort of porridge. Depends how hungry you are, but that's a very simple way of preparing it. Most things you do with wheat, though, you end up grinding it into flour. And there are all kinds of devices you can get to grind things with. This is a hand cranked
Raise
mill.
raise that up.
Yeah, there you
So
go.
you can see its construction. Yeah, okay, that's good.
Yep, that's a
Yeah.
Corona mill, which is a
In, and the wheat goes down through it, and
wheat
then comes
goes in
up
here. You set a
around.
bowl under here, and it catches the flour, and away you go. You don't get a very fine flour with this particular one, although it's good for some other things. Hmm.
They do have nowadays nice electric ones, and as long as you have
Well, I
uh,
was just going to show you my electric one,
it'll
which
do a lot faster
yeah,
work.
yeah, and a lot easier on your arms. Okay, can I get this up where you
You
can
know, when
see it?
you have arms like mine that don't work right, it's really
Anyway, this one here. Okay, yeah, you can see the mill,
good.
which and the big pulley, and then there's a motor with a little pulley on it, and so on and so forth. Yeah, it works pretty good.
Yeah,
Makes
and
a
you could in fact jury rig or make one of your own using, like, if you have an electric drill or something
yeah.
that you
Well,
could just
indeed, I jury rigged this. It's a motor from an old piece of machinery I had lying around here. It's a 24-volt DC motor, and I had to have a transformer and a rectifier in order to run it off 120-volt AC, but it all works.
yeah,
Uh,
I'm loaded. I'm loaded with 24-volt motors.
yeah,
All
yeah, they
my cripples
seem pretty common, don't they?
run on them. So
Yeah.
I must have a half a dozen of those powerful ones too. And then I got smaller ones in all my power tools. Uh, so, there are endless. I have an endless selection of those things to use if I needed to. And then, people talk about the dichotomy of, do I want to use power tools that are run on rechargeables, or do I want to plug in one? Which a lot of people tend to think are more, robust and, will be better in a collapse situation and so forth. And the thing is, it's a false dichotomy. Uh, I can always convert a uh, a DC operated deal into an AC operated deal, as long as you got the inverters, as long as you got the transformers to go AC to DC or DC to AC. You can always go back and forth. So, I like the power tools that are battery powered, and you don't have wires, and so you can sort of scoot around with them.
Pretty convenient, isn't it?
Yeah, it's much more convenient. And I do have some power tools still, sort of their relics that are straight AC. But nowadays, I get a lot out of the bats. I have a supply of 24-volt cobalt batteries. Cobalt equipment runs on 24 volts for the most part. And some of it runs on 36, 48, and so forth. But the 24s I can directly power my cripple cart with a power tools battery. Okay, I set it up with an adapter, and when I need to, if my lead acids fail on me for some reason, I just plug in the power tools battery. It'll go 5 miles, on one little bat, little lithium ion bat. So, it's worthwhile to have those. The more bats that you have, the more storage capacity you have. And God only knows, I got storage of bats. I have, what do you call it? Deep cycle marine batteries. I have car batteries. I have motorcycle batteries, cripple cart batteries, power tool batteries. It's endless. I'm not going to run out of battery power anytime.
That's good.
So, okay, back to food.
Well, we were talking about flour. Presumably, if you've set yourself up to make flour, or if you've, the other thing is flour itself lasts reasonably well. I have a bucket of it too that's strangely enough been around since about 2012, which would be 8 years, and it seems to be just fine. So that surprised me. It wasn't my intention to keep it that long, but it seems to be doing good. Anyways, one way or another, you've got some flour in your storage. And what are you going to do? Well, the obvious thing to do is make bread with it. And I've done a fair bit of that over the years. I've got some I'll show you in a minute here that I made yesterday. But along the way, it became obvious that running the oven, the electric oven inside the house in the summertime made things pretty miserable. So it gets hot. So I said, I wonder what I could do out of doors. So nosing around on Amazon.ca, I came upon this book, which I'll read the title now, Build Your Own Earth Oven. And I got the book and I built myself one, which now sits on my front yard. I'll show you that picture. There's a picture of such a thing. Mine is somewhat similar. It's just basically made out of adobe, mud and straw, and you burn wood inside. You heat the adobe up, and then you scrape the fire out when it's up to 7, 8, 9,000 degrees Fahrenheit or so, and put your bread in, and it bakes quite well. And that doesn't require electricity or anything but firewood. So that's an interesting thing.
How much firewood do you have to burn to get it up to temperature and then to bake a loaf of bread?
Not a whole lot. Let me see. Can I just sort of, maybe a pile about like so, a small fraction of a quart. And you don't want big chunks. You want to burn fast and hot to get the thing heated up. So little pieces is great.
Right.
I used to do quite a bit of woodworking, or I did more a few years ago, and I always had a lot of scraps of spruce and whatnot around, and pine, and they work great. So,
what about solar oven? Summertime, sun is out.
Yeah.
Those are. I've wanted to experiment with that quite a bit, but I haven't done so yet.
I haven't either. I imagine with a little dedication and a few false starts, you could probably set up a solar oven that would get hot enough to bake some bread.
Yeah,
no doubt.
it'd have to be the right day and temperature. And, you live in the Great White North of Canada. I live on the last great frontier of Alaska. Whatever your bin is, it's going to have to be well insulated in order to reach those temperatures inside. It's just the sunlight that comes in. It's how fast it radiates out the heat. It wouldn't be, I don't think, that easy to do in this kind of climate. But if you live a little bit south, with mid-latitudes and so forth, I don't think it would be too hard, and you wouldn't have to have a heavily insulated container. But it's worth experimenting with at some point.
Yeah, exactly. I know we're known as the Great White North, which is kind of ironic because you're a lot farther north than I am. I'm at about 43 degrees north latitude, so that is actually south of the 49th parallel. Most
I think
most of Ontario is.
I think I'm about 55, maybe 52, something like that. I'm not at the Arctic Circle. I think that's 60.
Okay.
I'm south of the Arctic Circle, but it's pretty far fucking north. Yeah.
It is. Yeah. Well, I don't know how hot it gets where you are in the summer, but yesterday it got up into the low 80s here. We went from a cool spring to all of a sudden summer, and it was quite a shock. and
Last year,
a nice sunny day too. So we
last
could
year
have.
was something of an anomaly. We did have 2 days during midsummer that topped 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Uh, and I think Anchorage, for the first time in recorded history, on one day, topped 90. But in general, in the summertime, midsummer, the max we hit is in the low 80s, and most of the time it's 70s.
That's all.
And right now it might be 60, 65, and it's rainy and it's a kind of dreary day. But what do you call it? I like it when I open the door and I see rain because I say, "Ooh, no wildfires."
Yeah.
I like seeing it wet, as long as I don't have to go outside and do stuff, ride my cripple cart in the rain or
Yeah, well, these wildfires seem to be getting to be a pretty regular thing in a lot of places in the world these days. I understand there's one going on in Saskatchewan, which is one of the prairie provinces in the middle of Canada, and it's still just the spring. Things haven't even had a proper chance to dry out yet. Anyway, back to food.
back to food.
Just show you what I did yesterday. I thought, oh, I should have something to show that's edible. So I baked some bread, and I was making up a new recipe, and it came out looking kind of like a brick.
It does, Rick.
But it worked. It rose better than maybe, and it had a nice internal structure, and it tastes great. You can judge by the fact that this is what's left of the first loaf, and I'm the one that's been doing most of the eating. So I kind of pigged out on that last night while watching TV. Anyways, good stuff. All kinds of. Go ahead.
Now this is, like I said, the bread rose. Do you use commercial yeast, or did you make your own starter yeast? How do you do that?
Yesterday. Yesterday I used commercial yeast. I have experimented quite a bit with sourdough, which is naturally occurring yeast, and that works pretty good too. And an interesting thing about sourdough bread, because it isn't just yeast growing it's also lactic acid bacteria that get going in it. That's the name sour. It lasts. If you leave that loaf I was just showing you sitting out, it'll go moldy in a distressingly short amount of time, very few days. But sourdough keeps better. It takes. I've had sourdough bread that lasted a couple of weeks, so that's another advantage. Along with the taste is pretty nice, and the fact that you don't have to have commercial yeast. Interestingly, here in Kincardine, one of the things that disappeared from the shelves about the same time as toilet paper was yeast. And they've got flour back and toilet paper and a lot of other things, but yeast has not yet returned to the shelves. I don't know the story behind that, but I had a couple of little bottles of yeast that will last me quite a long time. But if this goes on, at some point I'm going to have to get a batch of sourdough started up because I'll run out of yeast.
Well, you could try Amazon. Or
yeah,
probably
should.
If you can't find it in your local store, you can often get it, shipped to you by Amazon.
Yes, I've done that from time to time, especially if it's some kind of oddball ingredient that I'm interested in trying that nobody else in this little town would ever have thought of. Amazon to the rescue. Yes.
And that's right. Jeff Bezos. It's one of the few things that I appreciate about the guy.
Well, I hear lots of negative things said about Amazon and about its, I guess, CEO, you'd call him, Bezos. But if you live in an out-of-the-way part of the country, boy, you get to appreciate Amazon a lot.
Oh yeah, and I buy the subscription to Amazon Prime every year, so I get free shipping
Yep.
on most of the stuff. And you can't ship to Alaska. I mean, it often costs as much or more for the shipping as it does the item itself. So that I get several times the value of that yearly subscription, which costs, I don't know, $150, something like that. And it's worthwhile. And also, folks, let me tell you that when you buy from Amazon, if you go to the Amazon, what is it? Prime, not Amazon Prime, smile.amazon.com subway, and you designate Sustaining Universal Needs Foundation of Boiling Springs, South Carolina, as your charity, because we are a 501c3 corporation. If you do that, then every time you buy something on Amazon from the smile.amazon.com subweb, Jeff Bezos makes a donation to our nonprofit. And it doesn't cost you a dime extra. Okay? It's the same price to you, whether you go directly through Amazon or through the smile.amazon.com subway. So I encourage you, please. It'll help us out. I got to pay my fucking bills. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so every dime helps. It's not a lot, I mean, you buy a purchase for $100 and maybe I get 10 cents or something. I don't know. But it's something, okay? And it adds up. So the more of you who do it, the more it will help keep the diner operational and keep the information flowing. Because I don't have a huge budget, I don't take ads, and I only beg for money once a year. Okay. Off of that topic. So, all right. You talked about bread. I want to talk a little bit about meat. Okay. So, Irv talked about grains and about wheat and bread making, and its storage capability, how long it lasts and so forth, sourdough bread as opposed to regular bread, and it's a staple, okay? Very important staple. And then you can get, of course, pre-prepared stuff, spaghetti, rice, so forth. It's already dry and will last a very long time if properly stored. I want to talk a little about my personal favorite and storage obsession, which is meat and fish. When I first became aware of collapse in about 2007 and 2008, I went nuts, okay, in terms of buying preps, food, because I thought it was all going to come down in a year or 2 years. And so I was buying shit all the time. And I bought at the time a vacuum sealer and spent a whole lot of time vacuum sealing endless cuts of meat. Ribeyes, every time I saw a sale, buy a couple, 2, 3 ribeyes, and I vacuum seal them, I eventually I started dating them, and I'd throw them in the freezer. And eventually my freezer got so stuffed that I had to buy another freezer with those things. But I have worked through just about all of them. And, I ate a steak maybe a year ago that was one that I bought in 2008. Okay. So it was a good decade old. Had been in the freezer for a decade. And it was fine. And I barbecued up nice. Now, there was a second one that I had from the same era that the seal wasn't perfect. And it let air in. And so there was some freezer burn. And it was a little gray. Didn't have that nice red steak color. That, I said, doesn't look that bad. So I did a stew with it, and it was fine. You look at the condition of it when you take it out of the freezer, and you smell it and so forth, And then when you eat it, don't eat the whole thing at once, Take a bite, see how it sits, and if it's okay, then it's okay. And you can eat it. But anyway, since that time, I stopped doing it because it was too time consuming and a pain in the ass. And it's unnecessary right now because if you go to the food superstores, tons of meats are sold in commercially done vacuum seal packages, and I have a few. Okay. Here's one of my favorites. Okay, Nova Scotia salmon. All right, now, this stuff is in a vacuum seal bag. It's smoked and it's lightly salted. It's not heavily salted like the lox, like some lox. Nova Scotia has a lower salt. And just as it is refrigerated, it probably keeps a few months. But you throw this sucker in the freezer, it'll last years. Okay? Last forever. I don't know how long I've had this one. Pretty long. Let's see what it says. I haven't had the meat. Oh, yeah, there's a popular one that everybody buys all the time. Bacon. Bacon almost always comes in vacuum sealed bags. Okay? Again, if you just keep it in the fridge and you haven't opened the vacuum seal, then it's going to last you a couple of months. Easy. Maybe in 6 months. I don't know. I haven't checked that out. But you throw the sucker in the freezer, years. Okay? It'll be good for it. Okay, so let's get off the meat and onto the fat a little bit. And here's a really good story. Here's some Philadelphia brand cream cheese. Okay? It's just all fat. I just did a beef stroganoff with it, and I put cream cheese in my stroganoff, not just sour cream, which is also fat. I kept 2 of these in my fridge in my old apartment in when I lived in Wasilla. I'm in Palmer now. And I forgot about them. They were in the back of the fridge. And then when I moved, I took these out of the fridge and I put them in a cooler. So when I made my move here. And so they survived several years in the fridge, the trip in the cooler, and then another couple of years in the fridge over here. And then one day I was making bagels with locks, and I didn't have any new cream cheese that I bought. So I took one of them and I, said, well, maybe it's okay. And I opened up the foil wrapper, and sure enough, it was as good as the day they wrapped it in the factory. There was no problem. And that was not even freezing it. That was just in the fridge. All right. So, you got to watch these expiration dates that they have on these things. There, the FDA puts those regulations out, I think, just to get people to buy new stuff and throw out the old stuff. Because this stuff lasts forever, or close to it. All right? And then I'll wrap it up with something that doesn't take any refrigeration or freezing at all, which is Italian dry salami. Okay? This stuff is good forever. All right? Now, I carried around a dry salami when I was in Europe for the whole fucking summer. Well, no, I finished it probably before I was done, but and it never went bad. It was always edible. And the way I ate during that trip was I might stick a salami. I bought a French bread for like a quarter in those days, and then a wedge of cheese. And so I had cheese, salami, and bread for lunch and dinner and breakfast. And once a week, maybe I'd hit a restaurant if I could afford it. But dry salami, also, what do you call it? Kippers, like teriyaki strips and so forth. You can buy those in the grocery stores in packages. I have probably a few dozen of them. 16 ounce costs you maybe $10. But when you reconstitute it, because that's what I do, I soak it. I don't chew it because I don't have teeth to do that. When you do that, you soak it in water for a while. It goes up to twice the weight. Okay, so it's more like you're buying 2 pounds of meat, and then you cook that in with stir fries and that, and it's a little different texture than fresh meat, but it's still good. And even if you have no teeth, you can eat it. It's good. All right, so that's my contribution to this section. I got more props, but I'm not going to go through them all. I don't want to bore you. But Irv, see, now I don't have facility, space, physical capability, and so forth to do a lot of my own stuff. So I have to think about how to use the commercial stuff more. But Irv does. And he has another aspect of his food storage and preparation that he does, which is fermentation, which includes any number of things. So you want to fill us in on the things you do with fermentation?
Yeah, sure. There's sort of two branches of that, both of which are actually based on lactic acid bacteria. One is cheese, and the other one is things like sauerkraut, kimchi, and so forth, and pickles. Anyway, so I make cheese. I have a couple of pieces here, which I will hold up to the camera. That, according to what's written on it, if I can read it, is a chunk of cheddar, weighs about 4 pounds. It was made last November, and it'll be ready to eat probably this coming November. And
so you age it about a year?
I age it about a year. Yeah. Could be longer. You could go shorter, but really not a thing to be impatient about. Cheese, you want to wait until it's had a chance to age. Even more so in this case. This one's Parmesan, which I also did last November, and it should get 2 years, and it'll be really good when it's
where do you keep it while you age it, and what temperature? And
okay. Under our front porch, there is a cold room. And in one corner of the cold room, I built a little box, if you will, out of styrofoam insulating board, stuck it together with that urethane spray you get for filling up holes when you're building. And that keeps it that much closer to the temperature of the ground. You're aiming for around 55 Fahrenheit to age most of this cheese. And in the wintertime, I have to actually heat it up a little more. And in the summertime, I freeze gallon jugs of water in my deep freeze and put them in with the cheese to keep the temperature down to 55. It's not an exact, that part of it isn't too exact a science. Making the cheese, though, is a fairly scientific endeavor. And most of the time, I just use homogenized whole milk that's available at the local supermarket.
How much milk does that 4-pound cheddar take? How many gallons or whatever?
Let's talk quarts, which are roughly equivalent to liters, which is what it's sold in here. About 16 quarts. So 4 quarts, a gallon to a pound, a gallon of milk, a pound of cheese, roughly speaking.
Yeah.
Yeah, and some of the, like Parmesan, I don't know if you noticed, but the Parmesan is not as tall as the cheddar, and that's because it's a drier cheese. There's less moisture in there taking up space. Yeah, so occasionally, and I won't give any names or places, but I have got milk from local farmers. And in that case, it was sheep's milk, which is the very best milk to make cheese with.
Really better than goats. I have this goat's milk cheese that is my current favorite. It's a Florette, I think, and it's a soft cheese. Do you ever make soft cheeses, brie, and that sort of thing?
I make something very similar to that Philadelphia cream cheese you were talking about a moment ago. My wife every year at Christmas bakes up a lot of delicious goodies, and quite a few of them call for cream cheese in the process. And cream cheese is easy to make. It just takes overnight. Doesn't have to age at all. And I usually I'll put a couple of gallons of milk in and get out, a pound or two of cream cheese, which is a big chunk of cream cheese. If I'm not mistaken, the little package you were talking about there is 8 ounces, half a pound. So I make up the.
That one was a 16 ounce.
Was a 16 ounce? Okay, so I make up 3 or 4 of those equivalent. And they all get used up, and everybody's smiling about that.
What does that end up costing total to make it?
Let's see what the cheese costs. 4 liter, about $5 Canadian for a gallon of milk. So if I get a cup of $10 in milk, and then there's a little bit of some culture and some rennet to set it, and so. I don't know, $10, $12.
Yeah, you're not doing that much better than buying it.
No.
Because I can't remember what it costs, but maybe $4 for one of those.
Yeah. No, it isn't a lot cheaper than buying it. I think it's a better product.
Right, and if you did have your own sheep or your own goats or your own cow, to do it,
Yep.
then you're not paying for the raw material, the milk.
Exactly.
It's the cost of the milk that.
Well, and that's the thing. That's what cheese in the big picture is really about. If you're on a farm and you've got milking animals, be they goats, cows, or sheep, frequently you have surpluses of milk. And in itself, even if you turn it into yogurt, it's still only going to last like days, or in the case of yogurt, maybe a week or two. But turn it into cheese, and it'll last years. And it's concentrated, and so that's why it was invented, really, as a way of turning a very perishable foodstuff into something that lasts a long time. And incidentally, I suppose it tastes pretty good too.
Right. And this was all, again, we're used to and have become dependent on refrigeration to keep our stuff good. But you just go back to 1900, pre-refrigeration, and this is how you had to store stuff. And if it was milk, you would do that. You would make cheese out of it, and that allowed it to last you, and you could eat it through the winter. Okay, and so when your cows are milking, then you milk them as much as you can and make the cheese, and you got food for the winter.
Exactly, delicious food. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have some stuff here that I'll just very quickly show you.
Okay.
That's involved in making cheese. And the first thing is a big 20 quart stock pot. I'm using 16 quarts of milk, so I have to heat it up a bit. So you got to have something to put it in, and you want to heat it gently. So I use this canning kettle with some water in it and put it in there and set it on the stove, and works like a double boiler, and gently heats my milk up to whatever temperature I'm aiming for, generally somewhere in the 90 to between 90 and 120 Fahrenheit, depending on the type of bacteria I'm using. And then I've got I keep this little Ziploc bag with the various cultures in it in my deep freeze, so it lasts a long time. And the culture, you probably couldn't see it. It just looks like dried milk. The powdered milk you can buy. Well, that's what the culture is too. And it's made out of milk that has the bacteria in it. And
what does it take? Like a teaspoon or something or so? How much of that stuff you need to put in your 16 quarts?
About half a teaspoon.
Half a teaspoon.
So it goes a long way. And of course, these days you can get anything on the internet, and there's a number of different companies on the internet that supply materials for cheese making. The other thing, of course, that's key to making cheese is rennet, which is it's an enzyme actually that makes the milk curdle and turn into curds. And this just happens to be a solution of calcium chloride, which you put about a teaspoon of that in with those 16 quarts of milk, and it compensates for some of the violence that's done to the milk between the cow and the grocery store, the homogenization and so forth. Makes it work better. What else have I got? Yes, the other thing is I've got a good quality digital thermometer probe, which goes in the milk, because you got to monitor the temperature and maintain it. And the other one that's trickier yet, this little device, those lactic acid bacteria that are growing in the milk while you're turning it into cheese produce, of all things, lactic acid. And you got to stop it at a certain point, depending on the kind of cheese you're making. As it gets more acid, and with time, they turn the lactose sugar that's in the milk into lactic acid. And
What
anyways,
about using a pH meter?
that's a pH meter. Yeah.
Oh, that's pH meter. Okay.
Yeah. And you're usually, the milk starts out somewhere between 6 and 7, probably about 7 being neutral, so it's all a little bit acidic. And as the bacteria does its magic on the lactose, it'll get down, well, to 5.3, 5.2. That's right about where you would want for cheddar. If you're making feta, for instance, Greek cheese made from sheep's milk, it's down under 5, 4.8 or something to make it. But anyways, and I didn't bring any of them over, but I got a small stack of books on cheese making. It's I'm the kind of a guy. I'm lucky to be able to learn how to do things by reading a book, and doubly lucky because in this day and age we have books on almost everything, and
you can go on the internet.
You just go on the internet. You can find all kinds of information on there, and of course, you go to Amazon. You can find all the books you're looking for as well. So it's really wonderful that way. So that's cheese. Oh, wait a minute. One more thing. You may wonder how the cheese gets into that shape, that characteristic round shape. Well, that's because you have a thing called a press, and there's a thing like this, which I'm looking at you through, and it sits on this base, and then you put the cheese in there inside some cheesecloth.
Now you got to get a hold of the cheesecloth. So where do you get your supply of that?
The same place I get the cultures and the rennet and all this stuff.
Amazon.
There's some of it you may, but there's an outfit, and I won't be shy to give them there's a couple of outfits. One in the States, the New England Cheesemaking Company, that or something like that. You can find it from that on Google. And then there's Glengarry Cheese, which is here in Ontario, and both of them sell a pretty full range of the stuff you need. And then anyways, once you've got your curd ready and cut into pieces and cooked, and quite a bit of a rigmarole you go through to get it, put it in there, put this follower in behind. There's a little spring that fell on the floor, and I won't worry about that. And then you put this thingy on and crank it down, and it forces the last of the whey out of the curds and forms it into that shape. And of course, since I only have that one press, all my cheese ends up looking about the same. It's about the same size anyway. I guess that about wraps up cheese. And then there's
just one more question. What about wax coatings for your cheese? A lot of, when you buy a lot of cheeses, Gouda especially comes to mind, it's coated in wax. Have you ever experimented with that, and how much extra?
I have indeed. The problem with cheese in general is when you're aging it, mold wants to grow on it. And for some types of cheese, indeed, the mold is what gives it its flavor. Blue cheese, for instance. And I've accidentally made blue cheese more than once. But the wax, you put the wax in a pot, melt it, and dip your cheese that's ready to age in there. and it seals it completely so that the mold spores in the air can't get at it, and there you go. And that works fairly good, although not always 100%. There's a new product that I've been using, and it looks like your typical Elmer's white glue, and I suspect it may be somewhat similar actually, but it's called cream wax that's made for coating cheese. So you just paint it onto your round of cheese that's ready to start aging, and I usually give it a couple of coats, and that seals it up really well. It may not have looked like it, but both those pieces of cheese I showed you have that cream wax on them. The mold still grows, but it grows on the outside of the wax, and it doesn't affect the cheese. So yeah, that's a good point.
All right.
Yeah.
So you were going to get on to, I guess, the kimchi and the pickles and.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that you can do with fermenting, again, lactic acid bacteria that are everywhere. You know, you can't get away from them. And I have a book here. You may be able to see.
Fermentation.
Yep, it's by a guy by the name of Sandor Katz, and he goes through. Let me just give you a quick rundown the contents. Where are we? Okay. Well, yes, the sauerkrauts and the kimchis and things you can do with beans. It's not part of my own culture, but in Asia, miracles are performed with soybeans. And I mean, we've all heard of soy milk and tofu, but there are other things that can be done as well when you ferment those things. And of course, there's dairy ferments, which are basically the cheese we were talking about.
Miso.
Sorry?
Okay.
Oh yes,
Miso.
I've made miso. I have a pickling crock down in the basement here of miso that was made in 2011, I believe it was, and it's getting really good. I enjoy it quite a lot. I've also made soy sauce, which worked pretty well as well, but it disappeared rather quickly because it was good soy sauce, and it didn't last too long, so to speak. Anyways, the one I wanted to show you, one of these things is of European background, so to speak, and that's sauerkraut, which is basically fermented cabbage. If I grab, no, that's the kimchi. Here's the sauerkraut, and again, these are little 1 gallon. Yeah, 1 gallon.
No, that's a lot of crap.
Pails.
That'll go in a lot of hot dogs.
Yeah, yeah. So, there we are. Hope you can see that.
Oh yeah.
There's orange stuff in there. That's carrot, which works quite well in this too. It's basically fermented coleslaw almost. Tastes pretty good. Lasts a long time. That was made in December, and this is unlike the cheese, which is a pretty complex procedure. Sauerkraut, you slice your cabbage up into thin bits and sprinkle some salt over it in layers in a crock or a plastic bucket like that, and put it in a cool place. And there are enough naturally existing lactic acid bacteria to make the thing work. And over a period of days, it gets more and more acidic. And I actually tracked it with my my little pH meter just out of curiosity to see how it works. Looked up on the internet at what pH I was aiming for, which was less than 4. It's quite a bit more acid than the milk gets when you're making cheese, and works just fine. And that was what, 5, 6 5 months ago now, and it's still good. Now, the exact same idea, but this comes from Korea. There's stuff called kimchi, and following Sandor Katz, the guy in the book, I made not exactly the kind of kimchi they make in Korea, which is usually made primarily with Chinese cabbage. But he recommends a kimchi made out of root vegetables, things like daikon radishes, regular radishes, potatoes, turnips, rutabagas, all that kind of thing. Chop them up, put some salt on them, go away and let them stew, and you get essentially pickled root vegetables, pickled by the lactic acid that the bacteria makes. And here's a nice little piece of, I think it's radish. And if you'll excuse me, I like this so much. Very nice. Now, I haven't got any at the moment, but a few years ago, I made dill pickles the old-fashioned way using fermentation. And they came out very nicely. Describes in that book how to do this, but what else do I do here? I guess I might as well show you them. Last year, I came upon a recipe that my grandmother had used for making pickles, cucumber pickles. They're not like anything I've been able to obtain in the store. And it's one of those things from your childhood, you remember this taste, and you think, gee, I wish I'd get some of those. So it turned out my sister had gone to my grandmother before she passed on and taken down the recipe. A pretty rough outline of how to do this. But I had a good crop of cucumbers last year, and I made these pickles. I'm going to do it again this year and perfect it a bit. I cooked them a little long, and they're not as crisp as I'd like them to be, but they surely tasted good. It's a sweet pickle. And then, because I had lots of pickles, or lots of cucumbers, I made some dills as well.
Yeah, my favorite is garlic dill.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you can see there. On the top, there's actually some dill weed, floating in there. And the other thing there is, where I'm pointing to there, is a big a clove of garlic. And I don't know how many cloves there is in that jar, probably half a dozen. They taste pretty good, as you can imagine.
They look good.
And my wife loves bread. Sorry?
What about peppers? Do you ever do pickled peppers like jalapenos?
I haven't. And my youngest child loves hot stuff. In those sweet pickles, there's a couple or 2 or 3 chilies, this little dried chilies you get. And the cucumbers that were sitting next to the chili are pretty hot. Anyways, as I was saying, my wife likes bread and butter pickles, so she made a couple of batches of those. And I didn't forget pickled beans, which came out pretty well.
Yeah, and a lot of people really like pickled asparagus.
I haven't tried that. I like asparagus. So,
very popular, yeah. And it's especially good in the Bloody Mary. Okay, Irv.
All right, gang. Irv and I went into a good deal of detail about food, preparation, preservation, and so forth in this episode. And we still got more things to talk about and more techniques that you may be interested in learning that may help you, or if they don't help you, they may help your children or grandchildren. You have to think of that, because it's not just the saving of the material, the food and so forth, it's the saving of the knowledge. All right? And somebody has to be there to pass along this knowledge to the next generations. And so the more of this stuff you learn, the internet, even the books, probably aren't going to be available forever. And, the great library at Alexandria burned, all right, and knowledge that had been gained over millennia was lost for generations and further millennia. And the only secure method you have of communicating from one generation to the next is by teaching them what you know. It's not dependent on paper, it's not dependent on pens, it's not dependent on the internet or keyboards and so forth. So the more you can commit to memory, and that's something that people don't do anymore. In the old days, a storyteller could recite all of Beowulf at a sitting, and that's several hundred pages of stuff, and do it verbatim. Most people can't do that nowadays. So actors, good actors can do it, but for the most part, people can't commit that much stuff to memory. And then there are people who commit the Bible to memory. David Koresh was famous for that. You may say a lot of bad things about his cult, but David, he could recite the entire Bible, cover to cover. Quite amazing. And so, part of what we do here is to teach what we know, to encourage you to learn more, because it is still available, and commit it to memory. All right, that's important. Just knowing how to cook good fried rice recipe is a start. So a little at a time, as they say. We'll be back with more about collapse and more techniques and more things to learn and things to consider here in the near future, as long as the internet has not yet gone dark. And that's all the end. And that's all the doom. This time until next time, here on the Collapse Cafe of the Doomstead Diner.